Namaste, dear Hindu brothers and sisters. Today I want to take you in a time machine to a frightening place so that you fully appreciate what our Hindu ancestors endured for centuries under Islamic rule. You travel back in time to 1398. The place? A dark winter night outside Delhi. Here is what you see. There is frost in the air. The earth is hard beneath thousands of bare feet. The camp stretches beyond sight, a slow-moving city made of ropes and exhaustion. No drums beat, no banners wave. Only breathing, heavy, frightened breathing. They have been marching for weeks, from villages that no longer have walls, from towns that no longer have temples, from homes that still smolder in the memory of those who walked away from them in chains. You realize you are in Timur's camp. The chronicler of Timur's invasion records that when his army advanced towards Delhi, nearly 100,000 prisoners were already in his camp. 100,000. Not soldiers, not enemy generals, prisoners. Men with rope-burned wrists, women whose children have stopped crying because crying wastes strength, children who no longer ask where they are going. When numbers grow that large, they begin to lose their shape. So imagine it differently. Imagine a city emptied. Imagine every face you know removed from its street. Imagine a column of humanity long enough that the first group cannot hear the last. This is what 100,000 means. And then the order comes. The chronicler records that Timur feared these prisoners might revolt during the coming battle. The solution was immediate. They were to be executed. The text preserves the number again. 100,000 killed, in a single wave, before battle, before noon. It was not chaos, it was premeditation. That morning outside Delhi was not the beginning of this story. It was the culmination of a pattern already centuries old. Because captivity on this scale does not emerge suddenly. It grows from precedent. It grows from repetition. It grows from systems that normalize the transformation of human beings into movable property. Long before Timur, the soil of India had already absorbed the sound of chains. In the 8th century, during the Arab conquest of Sindh, early narrative traditions associated with Muhammad bin Qasim describe massive enslavement. At Roor, 60,000 reduced to slavery. At Brahmanabad, 30,000. At Multan, 6,000. These are the numbers preserved in the early conquest accounts. Whether rounded or precise, they reveal magnitude. Tens of thousands removed, not as temporary hostages, but as transferable bodies. Picture Sindh in that moment. A town in Sindh, after defeat. Doors broken inward, smoke hanging low over the fields. A boy searching for his father among rows of bound men. A woman pulled aside because youth makes her valuable as a sexual slave. A grandmother left behind because she cannot walk fast enough to matter. This is how slavery enters a land. Not quietly, not abstractly, but through the sorting of human worth. Why did these early campaigns produce such numbers? The primary narratives themselves provide clues. Conquest was framed as Islamic expansion and demonstration of Islamic religious supremacy. War captives were classified as lawful spoils under prevailing jurisprudence. But just religious fanaticism alone does not explain scale. War had to finance itself. Captives were currency. They could be distributed to soldiers, they could be sold, they could be absorbed into households or transported beyond the frontier. They weakened the conquered permanently. A village stripped of its young cannot resist again soon. And so the pattern sets. Victory is not only land taken, it is people taken. The Islamic machine learns quickly. Bodies are portable wealth. By the 11th century, this logic deepens. Mahmud of Ghazni's raids penetrate North India with surgical repetition. The chronicler Al-Utbi celebrates his campaigns. Temple destruction is described as Islamic triumph. But alongside the breaking of idols, there is another consistent detail: captives. In connection with Kannauj, the preserved figure is 53,000 prisoners taken, and the economic detail that follows makes the horror intimate. They were sold for 2 to 10 dirhams each. 2 to 10, a price range. At that valuation, 53,000 becomes an industry. Merchants travel for such opportunity. Caravans expand, markets swell. A raid in Kannauj becomes labor in distant lands. A child from the Gangetic Plain becomes a servant in a city he cannot pronounce. Some boys are selected for military training. Some are forced into hard labor. Some are altered permanently through castration and turned into eunuchs to guard royal harems, a known function of imperial slave systems across regions. The violence is not always loud. Sometimes it is administrative. Registration, inspection, assignment, and when a practice repeats across campaigns, it becomes expectation. By the time the Delhi Sultanate consolidates power, slavery is no longer episodic. It is structural. And the numbers continue. By the 13th century, captivity in North India is no longer only the aftermath of a raid. It becomes embedded inside the structure of power. Hasan Nizami, writing in the Tajul Ma'asir, records that in fighting near Mount Abu, more than 20,000 slaves were taken. More than 20,000. That is not a border skirmish. That is the emptying of districts. Later chronicling, connected to the capture of Kalinjar under Qutb al-Din Aibak, speaks of 50,000 men coming under the collar of slavery. Under the collar. The phrase itself carries weight. It does not describe temporary prisoners. It describes ownership. Imagine Kalinjar after the fall. The fortress breached, the defenders dead or scattered, the survivors gathered in rows. A man forced to watch as his son is pulled to one side. A young woman evaluated not as a daughter but as sexual property. A boy too small to resist marked for a caravan. This is what 50,000 means. It means a generation thinned. It means songs in a village that will never be sung the same way again. Why does this continue? Because enslavement has proven profitable. Captives supply labor without negotiation. They provide domestic service. They provide soldiers who owe everything to the ruler who owns them. They create a population that has no local loyalty, only dependence upward. Under Alauddin Khilji, the chronicling tradition reports around 50,000 slave boys in service, 70,000 enslaved laborers employed in works of the state. 70,000. Think of that number not as abstract. Think of stone rising into arches and towers. Think of calloused hands lifting blocks for monuments that will outlive the men who laid them. The splendor of court architecture rests on invisible backs, and the invisibility is deliberate, because when a system grows that large, it becomes normalized. Under Firoz Shah Tughlaq, the figure preserved is 180,000 slaves under his authority. 180,000. 12,000 trained as artisans, 40,000 serving as guards, a department created to manage them. This is not accidental accumulation. It is policy, it is administration. It is a ruler who counts his enslaved population the way another ruler might count cavalry. Imagine the record room. Names written in ink, assignments given, children born into bondage because their parents were taken years before, women transferred between households as political favors, boys trained not to remember where they came from. A few captives, especially young boys taken early, could rise within military or administrative structures, provided they survived the military campaigns, often against their own people. But even mobility does not erase origin. The entry point into this world is capture. It is separation, it is loss. And in some cases, it is irreversible alteration. Across medieval Islamic imperial systems, enslaved boys were sometimes cruelly castrated and trained for service in royal harems or courtly environments. Such practices are documented in wider slave traditions of the era. When these Islamic practices intersected with Indian conquests, captives became subject to that machinery. The violence there is neither quiet but permanent. Castration in the medieval era were both painful and dangerous. Historians estimate that only 10% of the victims survived a life redirected, a body changed forcibly so that it can serve safely inside guarded chambers. And beyond the palace walls, markets operate. Barani's administrative observations reference regulated pricing structures in Delhi. Domestic female slaves priced in one range, those considered suitable for sexual slavery in another. Young male slaves priced differently for both sex and labor. Once a price grid exists, morality has been converted into arithmetic. Why did rulers maintain such systems instead of abandoning them? Because slavery solved multiple problems at once. It funded campaigns, it rewarded soldiers, it supplied labor without bargaining. It created loyal military cadres detached from local clans, and it projected an image of overwhelming authority. Possessing thousands of slaves was not only economic strength, it was symbolic dominance. It said, I can take and keep what I conquer. But for those taken, the story is smaller and more intimate. It is a girl learning a new language not because she chooses to, but because survival requires it. It is a boy who forgets the name of his village because no one around him speaks it anymore. It is a father who cannot protect his family because his hands are bound by decree. That is what our Hindu ancestors faced. When such stories repeat across centuries, they leave sediment. Memory becomes caution. Caution becomes silence. Silence becomes fracture. And then, in 1398, Timur's camp stands outside Delhi with 100,000 prisoners already bound. Sit with that in silence for a few minutes. a system centuries in the making. When Timur ordered the execution of 100,000 prisoners outside Delhi, he was not inventing brutality, he was applying logic. The Zafarnama does not describe the act as madness, it describes it as strategy. Prisoners might revolt, therefore eliminate risk. In that single calculation, you see the final stage of a long pattern. First capture, then classification, then commodification, then management, and finally disposal. The captives had already been counted, already marched, already reduced to entries in a ledger of victory. The order merely erased what had been recorded. Imagine standing in that camp as the realization spreads. The ropes are not being loosened, they are being tightened. There is no auction, there is no redistribution. There is only a wave moving through the ranks of prisoners and then silence where voices had been. This is what happens when human beings become inventory. Inventory can be sold. Inventory can be transferred. Inventory can be destroyed. Across centuries in northern India, conquest produced Hindu captives because captives produced power. The motives were consistent. Religious language framed victory as righteous expansion of Islam against Kafirs. Economic reality turned prisoners into revenue. Political strategy transformed captives into loyal dependents. Prestige demanded spectacle. When an Islamic ruler could display thousands of enslaved men, women, and children, it signaled total domination. And so the machine continued. Sindh 60,000, Kannaujas 53,000, Mount Abu's 20,000, Kalinjar's 50,000, Khalji's 70,000 laborers. Firuz Shah's 180,000 enslaved subjects. Each number represents not just bodies but severed continuity. Villages that never repopulated the same way. Temples that lost their custodians. Lineages that ended in silence. Children who grew up without memory of where they began. Some captives adapted. Some survived. Some rose within the very systems that had consumed them and turned on their own people, like Malik Kafur. But survival inside bondage does not erase the violence of entry. To be taken is to lose choice. To be priced is to lose dignity. To be altered for service is to lose sovereignty over one's own body. When you step back and ask why such practices endured, the answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. Because they worked. They funded campaigns, they rewarded armies, they weakened resistance permanently, they built monuments, they staffed courts, they fed imperial ambition. And in medieval political culture, that combination was considered success. The chroniclers wrote of it without apology, sometimes with pride, sometimes with administrative calm, but rarely with doubt. That absence of doubt is itself revealing. It tells us that enslavement had been normalized within those power structures, not hidden, not denied, but integrated, which is why the story must be remembered clearly, not to inflame, not to generalize, but to understand how Islamic systems reshaped our dharmic civilization. When tens of thousands are removed repeatedly over generations, society adjusts. It becomes cautious, it becomes fractured. It carries trauma in ways that architecture and chronicles cannot fully express. If you stand again at dawn outside Delhi in 1398 and let the number settle, 100,000, you begin to grasp the scale of human disappearance. Not all at once, but through centuries of precedent that made such an order conceivable. The tragedy is not only that it happened, the tragedy is that it became routine enough to calculate. And that is the final lesson. When power sees people as resource, morality becomes secondary to utility. When conquest sees bodies as currency, compassion recedes. And when chroniclers record such numbers without hesitation, guilt, or shame, they are leaving behind more than statistics. They are leaving testimony. Testimony of a period when slavery under Islamic rule in India was systematic, scaled, and sustained. The record remains, the numbers remain, the stories remain, even when names do not. And memory, if it is honest, must remain as well. And if you listen closely beneath the chronicles and the numbers, you can almost hear something else. Not the clash of steel, not the proclamations of victory, but the quiet erasure of ordinary Hindu lives. A farmer who never returned to his field. A child who forgot the sound of her own language. A family line that ended not in battle but in bondage. History often remembers kings. It records campaigns, it preserves titles, but it rarely pauses long enough for the unnamed. Slavery under these regimes was not only a political institution, it was a human wound. And wounds, even when centuries old, deserve to be acknowledged. This history is not easy. Even listening to it is difficult, but turning away from truth is far more dangerous. Our civilization has endured much, and now it is time to learn it, to understand it, and to preserve it. If you believe that honest, research based conversations about our past matter, then subscribe to this channel today. Turn on the bell notification and share this video with anyone who wants to seriously understand the history of India. Carry your heritage with dignity, in your thoughts, in your conduct, and for our men, even in the proud wearing of Vibhuti and Chandan Tilak. Because an informed society becomes a strong society. I will see you again soon. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, Vande Matram.